8%, that was the number on the advert. 8% a year fixed on your savings at a time when a high street bank would give you well under 1. The company was called London Capital and Finance. It was based in Kent. It was authorised by the Financial Conduct Authority. And between 2013 and 2018, 11,625 people handed it £237 million. Most of them weren't wealthy. Many were retired. A lot of them were moving money out of a cash savings account or out of an ISA because 8% sounded like the difference between a comfortable retirement and an anxious one. They weren't reckless. They were doing the thing everybody's told to do, which is to make your savings work harder. Then, on the 30th of January 2019, the company went into administration. The administrator's early estimate was that investors might get back around 20% of what they'd put in. The obvious question is how a firm regulated by the FCA managed to lose 11,000 people's money. And the obvious answer is that the regulator was asleep. That's part of it. It's a smaller part than you'd think, and stopping there means missing the mechanism that actually did the damage. So let's start with what people were actually buying. It was called a mini-bond. A mini-bond is a way for a company to borrow directly from the public. You lend the firm your money, the firm promises to pay you interest, and at the end of the term it promises your capital back. That's it. There's no share, no fund, no asset behind it. There's a promise, and the promise is only as good as the company making it. Here's the part that matters. Issuing a mini-bond is not in itself a regulated activity. A company doesn't need FCA authorization to sell one. So the product sat outside the regulatory perimeter entirely. No approval, no oversight, and critically, no protection from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, the safety net that covers your money if a regulated firm fails. But London Capital and Finance was authorized by the FCA. It held permissions. It just didn't need them for the thing it was actually doing. Dame Elizabeth Gloster, the former Court of Appeal judge who later investigated all this, gave that arrangement a name. She called it the halo effect. A firm holds regulatory permissions it doesn't use, and those permissions lend credibility to activities that aren't regulated at all. To a customer reading a website, there's no visible difference. The FCA logo doesn't come with an asterisk explaining which parts of the business it applies to. And the company leaned on that hard. The FCA later found that LCF's promotions painted a misleading picture of the bonds, making them look far more attractive than they were. Investors weren't told about hidden charges. They weren't told about the real nature of the lending going on underneath, and the bonds were advertised as ISA compatible when they weren't. There's one detail from the regulator's findings that's worth sitting with. LCF used bondholders' own money to fund comparison websites that looked independent. Those sites showed LCF's minibonds sitting next to safer investments with lower returns. So a saver doing exactly the right thing, going away and comparing options before committing, was often landing on a page the company had paid for. The due diligence was part of the sales funnel. Now, where did the money go? The pitch was that LCF lent to British small businesses after rigorous checks. What the High Court found years later was that a great deal of it went to a cluster of connected companies known as the London Group, run by LCF's own director and his business associates. Bondholders were never told about that connection. They also weren't told what it cost to sell them the bond. LCF used a sales and marketing agent called Surge Financial, and Surge was paid 25% of the gross amount raised from bondholders, a quarter. Before a single pound reached a single business, a quarter of it had already gone. An expert witness at the trial put it plainly, and the judge accepted it. A commission of 25% wasn't a credible rate that two independent parties would have agreed to, given the business LCF was telling investors it was in. The number only makes sense if the business isn't the business. And here's where the whole picture turns over. Because up to this point you could tell a story about a badly run company, over-promising, overcharging, lending carelessly, getting it wrong. That story has villains in it, but it's a story about failure. That isn't what the High Court found. On the 14th of November 2024, after a trial lasting 20 weeks, Mr. Justice Miles concluded that London Capital and Finance had operated as a Ponzi scheme. The judgment set out how it worked. LCF would very frequently pay money from new bondholders out to borrowers, and those borrowers would return the money to LCF almost immediately, so LCF could use it to pay interest and redemptions to existing bondholders. Round in a circle. The court found LCF depended almost entirely on new investment to pay old investors because there was no independent income coming in from its borrowers to pay them with. Think about what that means for the 8%. The interest wasn't a return on anything. It was other people's deposits, arriving that week, going straight back out. Every payment that reassured an existing bondholder was funded by a new one who'd just been reassured the same way. The court found that more than £136 million had been paid out, directly or indirectly, to the defendants. It upheld claims including fraudulent trading, breach of fiduciary duty, dishonest assistance, and knowing receipt. So the regulator's failure isn't the cause of the losses. It's what let the cause run for 5 years without being interrupted. And it was interrupted eventually and quickly once someone looked. The FCA went into LCF's offices in December 2018, ordered it to withdraw its promotional material, and told the company to take advice on whether it was solvent. 7 weeks later, it was in administration. The problem was never that the regulator couldn't act. It's that for years nothing made it look. The government ordered an independent investigation, and Dame Elizabeth Gloster's report landed in December 2020. It ran to nearly 500 pages. Her conclusion was that the FCA did not discharge its functions in a way that let it effectively fulfill its statutory objectives. She found the regulator had let LCF hold permissions it neither used nor needed. She found warnings had come in and gone nowhere. Bondholders described it as gross regulatory failure. The report made 13 recommendations. All of them were accepted. Andrew Bailey, who ran the FCA during much of the relevant period, and by then was Governor of the Bank of England, apologized to the people who'd lost their savings. Then came the awkward question of who pays. Most bondholders had no claim on the compensation scheme because minibonds weren't regulated, and the scheme only pays out when a regulated activity took place. Some did qualify on narrower grounds. By April 2021, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme had paid £57.6 million to 2,871 bondholders. For everybody else, the government did something it explicitly said it didn't want to make a habit of. The Treasury set up a one-off scheme funded by the taxpayer and was careful to call the situation unique and exceptional. It paid 80% of what a bondholder had originally put in, capped at £68,000. Anything already received in interest or from the administrators came off the total. The scheme opened in November 2021, closed at the end of October 2022, and paid out £115 million. So the arithmetic roughly is this: 237 million went in, a little over 170 million came back out through the two compensation routes, most of it from public money, and a lot of individual bondholders still ended up short. The criminal side is slower, and it's worth being precise here. The Serious Fraud Office has been investigating suspected fraud and money laundering at LCF for years. As things stand, that investigation is still open, and nobody has been convicted of fraud in connection with it. What has happened is stranger and smaller. LCF's former chief executive was made subject to a restraint order, which is a court order freezing assets while an investigation continues. He breached it. He'd already received a suspended sentence for moving £95,000 to his wife. Then in 2026, he and his wife admitted further breaches, including selling restrained items. Among them a hot tub and a set of horse saddles, worth together not quite £5,800. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. The judge called it an attack on the administration of justice. That's the shape of it 7 years on. A civil court has found a Ponzi scheme. A public inquiry has found regulatory failure. The taxpayer has covered most of the loss. And the criminal question, the one everybody actually wants answered, is still open. Something did change, though. In response to Gloster, the FCA adopted what it calls a use it or lose it approach to permissions. Firms that haven't earned regulated income for 12 months risk losing their authorization. The regulator's own chief executive said the point was to reduce the risk of firms holding a permission purely to add credibility to their unregulated activities. Read that sentence again because it's an admission. The regulator is saying in public that its own stamp had become a marketing asset, detachable from the thing it was supposed to certify. The fix isn't better supervision of minibonds, it's making the badge harder to rent. And that's the lesson worth taking out of this because it generalizes. The failure here wasn't that a dangerous product went unregulated, Plenty of things go unregulated, and most people know to be careful with them. The failure was that an unregulated product was sold from behind a regulated shopfront, and no ordinary person looking at it could tell where one ended and the other began. The 8% was never the warning sign people think it was. 8% is unusual, not impossible. The warning sign was structural and it was invisible by design. A saver would have had to know that authorization attaches to firms rather than products, that minibonds sit outside the perimeter, that the compensation scheme follows regulated activity rather than regulated companies, and that a comparison site can be bought. Nobody's savings should depend on knowing all that, and for 11,625 people they did.